Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we re-sinking into one of those topics that makes you quietly grateful you were born in the age of Wi-Fi and indoor plumbing. Because honestly, you wouldn't last a day in medieval times. I mean, people back then barely lasted a day themselves. Now, when I say medieval times, don't picture the cheesy dinner theater with knights handing you chicken legs while yelling about honor. No, the real medieval world was dirtier, darker, and honestly, smellier than you'd ever want to imagine. Forget the castles and shining armor for a moment. Most people lived in tiny wooden huts that leaked when it rained, froze in the winter, and filled with smoke every time someone tried to cook. Basically, the original open-plan nightmare. And let's not even start on hygiene. Actually, no, let's absolutely start there. Because bathing was optional, and by optional, I mean most people didn't bother. A bath for a peasant was usually just standing in the rain for a few minutes and hoping no one noticed the smell. Nobles, meanwhile, might have had access to tubs, but water had to be carried bucket by bucket, heated over a fire, and then sat in until it went cold. So, yeah, nobody smelled like lavender. They smelled like damp wool and despair. Food wasn't much better. Bread was a staple, and it was so coarse and gritty that it actually wore people's teeth down to little nubs. Imagine chewing on sandpaper every day, 3 times a day. Meat, rare. Unless you were noble, and even then, it was usually half-rotten, heavily salted, and spiced just enough to make you forget you were chewing something vaguely suspicious. So, yeah, surviving medieval times wasn't glamorous, but don't worry. Tonight, we're not just talking about how quickly you'd crumble in the mud and plague. We're also going to wander through the delightful disasters of royals, nobles, and random elites who somehow managed to make things even worse for themselves. Spoiler, if inbreeding were an Olympic sport, half of Europe's royal families would have been permanent gold medalists. Let's float over, then, to our first example of why medieval times were basically a slow-motion tragedy. So, let's begin with a fan favorite, medieval royalty. Because if you think peasants had it rough, just wait until you hear how the so-called lucky ones lived. Spoiler, wealth doesn't cure stupidity, and it definitely doesn't cure genetic roulette. Take for instance, the lovely tradition of marrying your cousin. And when I say cousin, I don't mean the distant, my mom's uncle's step-nephew kind. I mean, first cousin, sometimes uncle, sometimes niece. Because why branch out the family tree when you can just circle it like a wilted wreath? The Habsburgs are, of course, the shining, or maybe drooling, example here. They ruled half of Europe, collected titles like cards, and proudly passed down a jawline that looked like someone had tried to sculpt Plato with a brick. Charles II of Spain, famous not for his policies, but for being so inbred that he could barely chew food properly. The poor man was described as looking both pale and sickly and also constantly drooling, which you know isn't exactly the kind of royal presence you want at state dinners. And yet, somehow, he was king. Imagine walking into a room where nobles are debating the fate of empires, and in the middle sits Charles, struggling to string sentences together and choking on breadcrumbs. That was Spain's leadership. But here's the kicker. Despite the misery of their genetics, these dynasties were convinced this was the best way to rule, because heaven forbid you marry a royal. Better to collapse the family line into a puddle of weak chins and tragic medical records than risk your daughter falling in love with someone who didn't own half a kingdom. Of course, the peasants weren't much better off. They didn't have luxury problems like my cousin is also my wife. No, their main concern was, will I live long enough to see the harvest? Spoiler again, usually not. Most people died before 40. Childhood was basically a Hunger Games audition. 1/3 of kids didn't survive to adulthood. And that's just scratching the surface. Let's drift into another charming part of medieval life. Let's talk about medicine. Or, well, what medieval people thought medicine was. Because honestly, you would not survive a medieval doctor's visit. Unless, of course, you consider bloodletting and leeches a fun spa day. If you showed up to a physician complaining of, say, stomach pain, they'd probably nod wisely and announce that your humors were out of balance. Humors, in case you missed that delightful science class, were the four bodily fluids they thought controlled everything: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Basically, your insides were a medieval soup. If you sneezed too much, they thought you had too much phlegm. If you were sad, clearly too much black bile. And the solution? Obviously, stab you with a knife and drain out some blood. Problem solved. And this wasn't fringe nonsense. Kings, queens, nobles, they all bought into it, even when it killed them. Take King Charles VIII of France. He walked into a doorframe, smacked his head, and doctors decided the best way to help was to slice open his skull and drain excess humors. He died almost instantly because, turns out brains don't appreciate amateur carpentry. Then there were plagues. Oh, the plagues. If you think the 2020 pandemic was bad, imagine one that wiped out half of Europe. And instead of vaccines, your neighbors were waving incense and shouting prayers in your face. Doctors wore those creepy bird masks filled with herbs, which, let's be honest, probably just made them smell like a salad bar while people died around them. The irony: sometimes the peasants did better than the doctors. A village-wise woman with a few herbs might actually soothe your fever. The professional physicians, meanwhile, were busy suggesting you drink ground-up emeralds. Yes, powdered jewels. Nothing says cure for dysentery like swallowing crushed rock worth more than your entire house. So you wouldn't last long with medieval medicine. One splinter could mean infection. One cough could spiral into, let's release the humors, and before you know it, you're gone. Let's drift from medicine, though, and float over to the oh-so-comfortable world of medieval food and dining disasters. So, picture yourself sitting down at a medieval feast. Maybe you're imagining a giant hall, flickering candles, long tables piled with roasted meats. Sounds cozy, right? Except, it wasn't at all. For starters, forks weren't really a thing yet. People ate with knives, spoons, and mostly their fingers, which meant everyone's greasy, unwashed hands were dipping into the same dishes. The nobles loved big communal platters. So if the guy next to you had the plague, congratulations, you just shared his germs with your goose leg. The food itself was complicated. Nobles showed off their wealth by eating meat. But meat didn't exactly come fresh from a refrigerator truck. It was dragged in from wherever it could be found, salted until stiff, and then buried under spices. Spices were the medieval version of Instagram filters, a way to hide how bad something really looked, or in this case, smelled. If your venison tasted suspiciously like it had been dead for a week, just drown it in cinnamon and pepper. Problem solved. Bread was another issue. The rich got white, refined loaves, while peasants gnawed on something closer to stone. Coarse bread was so full of grit from the grinding stones that it literally shaved your teeth down. Archaeologists have dug up skeletons with teeth worn flat, like someone tried to polish them with sandpaper. Not exactly the best dental plan. And then there was pottage. Imagine a sad stew made of whatever you had lying around. Grains, vegetables, maybe a bit of meat if you were lucky. People just kept the pot simmering for days, even weeks. You'd eat from it today, toss in scraps tomorrow, and hope nothing too alive was swimming around by Friday. Of course, the nobles tried to get creative. They liked elaborate dishes like roasted peacocks served with feathers reattached for decoration. Very Instagrammable. If Instagram had been invented in 1345, guests were impressed, though probably less impressed when they bit into something that tasted like leather boots. So medieval dining wasn't quite the glamorous banquet you're picturing. It was more like a germ-sharing contest mixed with a dental nightmare. Let's drift away from the dinner table now and wander into another medieval disaster. Fashion. Medieval fashion. If you've ever complained about skinny jeans being uncomfortable, let me assure you, you'd never survive a single medieval wardrobe. For peasants, clothing was simple. Scratchy wool, rough linen. Maybe, if you were very lucky, a single pair of shoes that had to last you through every season until they disintegrated into sad little flaps. Most people owned one outfit. You wore it to work, to church, to weddings, to funerals, and then to your own funeral. Laundry wasn't exactly happening on the regular, so let's just say Eau de Barnyard was the standard fragrance. Nobles, on the other hand, loved to make things complicated. Men strutted around in tights, so snug they left little to the imagination. And then came the codpiece, that infamous little pouch sewn over the crotch area. It started as a practical fix to cover the gap between hose, but quickly escalated into a full-blown fashion arms race. Some were padded, some were decorated. Some were so large they looked like medieval storage compartments. Because, of course, nothing says, respect my authority, like strapping a fabric balloon to your pants. Women's fashion wasn't much better. Highborn ladies were shoved into gowns with sleeves so long they dragged on the ground like mop heads. Headgear was its own brand of ridiculous. Tall, pointy hinnants, you know, those cone-shaped hats with a veil, looked whimsical, but were basically giant windcatchers. Imagine walking through a medieval courtyard on a breezy day with a 3-foot cone strapped to your scalp. Very dignified. And don't forget shoes. The nobility loved poulaines, those absurd pointy shoes that stretched out like medieval ski equipment. The longer the tip, the higher your status. Some were so exaggerated that laws had to be passed limiting their length. Because apparently, tripping over your own footwear while trying to look royal was becoming a public hazard. So yes, fashion was another reason you'd never last. Either you'd be freezing in peasant rags or suffocating in noble cosplay. No middle ground. Let's quietly step away from the wardrobe now and wander over into the charming, not at all traumatizing world of medieval childhood. Medieval childhood, or, more accurately, the lack of it, because honestly, you wouldn't survive being a kid back then. For starters, half of all children never made it past age 5. Diseases, accidents, malnutrition, take your pick. Childhood wasn't about playing with toys. It was about dodging death on a daily basis. A scraped knee could turn into a fatal infection. A bad winter could mean starvation. Even nobles lost children constantly, and yet people just accepted it. Kids were seen less as little bundles of joy, and more like temporary investments. If one died, well, hopefully the next one would stick. And the ones who did survive, no playdates, no cartoons. The moment you could walk, you were basically put to work. Peasant children herded animals, carried water, gathered firewood, or helped in the fields. Noble kids weren't out chasing butterflies either. They were being trained for marriage alliances or military service before they even learned to write their own names. Imagine being 10 years old and already promised to some 40-year-old duke you'd never met. Romantic toys did exist, but they were usually homemade scraps. A carved wooden figure, a rag doll, maybe a stick that doubled as a sword. Nobles had slightly fancier versions, like miniature knights or hobby horses. But let's be real. After a long day of chores, how much energy do you think kids had left to play? Education wasn't guaranteed either. Most peasant kids learned practical skills, not reading or writing. Noble boys might get tutors, but girls, they were often trained in sewing, etiquette, and, of course, how to look appealing enough for a dynastic marriage contract. Yay, feminism. And then there was discipline. Let's just say gentle parenting hadn't been invented. Parents and teachers thought nothing of beating kids into obedience. A wooden rod across the back was considered a perfectly normal learning tool. So yeah, if you think your childhood was rough because your Wi-Fi was slow, try surviving medieval childhood. Odds are, you wouldn't have. Let's float now into another delightfully grim area of medieval life. Cleanliness, or rather, the total absence of it. Cleanliness in the Middle Ages. Or, more accurately, the spectacular lack of it. Honestly, you wouldn't last a week. Bathing was a rare event. Peasants might wash in a stream once in a while, but for the most part, people layered dirt on dirt until they resembled walking compost heaps. Water wasn't exactly trusted, either. Folks believed bathing too often could weaken the body, make you vulnerable to illness. Which is funny, considering not bathing probably did the exact opposite. The rich technically had access to baths. Wooden tubs were hauled into rooms, filled bucket by bucket, and heated over a fire. But this was a luxury event, not a daily habit. A noble might bathe a few times a year, more if they were unusually clean. And by clean, I mean slightly less smelly than a horse stable. There were public bathhouses in cities, kind of like the medieval version of a spa. But they doubled as brothels. So if you went in hoping for a quick scrub, chances were you'd leave with more than just clean skin. By the late Middle Ages, the church frowned on bathhouses entirely, labeling them sinful. Because of course, better to smell like a corpse than risk immorality. Tooth care barely existed. People might rub their teeth with cloth, or chew on herbs to freshen their breath. No toothpaste, no floss, which explains why so many skulls from the era show rotted teeth, abscesses, and jaws that probably ached constantly. Imagine every meal being a dental nightmare. Clothing wasn't washed often either. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were just part of the experience. People scratched themselves raw, and entire households could be crawling with vermin. Even nobles, under all that silk and velvet, were basically hosting tiny insect kingdoms. So yes, you would crumble under medieval hygiene standards. 1 week of living without showers, surrounded by fleas, and you'd be begging for your modern bottle of shampoo. Let's drift now into another delightful medieval hazard. The joys of travel. Travel sounds romantic in a medieval storybook. Knights on horseback, pilgrims on winding roads, merchants carrying treasures. In reality, you wouldn't make it past the first mile. Roads were, to put it kindly, disasters. Most were little more than muddy tracks carved through fields. When it rained, they turned into swamps. When it snowed, good luck, bridges were rare. So travelers often had to wade through rivers, hoping not to drown or lose a boot in the muck. And if you were riding in a cart, forget about smooth journeys. It was like being rattled around inside a wooden box with square wheels. Then there was the danger. Highwaymen, bandits, and just plain desperate peasants saw travelers as walking coin purses. If you were carrying anything valuable, you were basically advertising, "Please rob me." Merchants often traveled in caravans for protection, and even then, plenty never made it home. Inns existed, but let's not imagine cozy fireplaces and soft beds. Think more overcrowded, flea-infested wooden shacks where strangers slept, shoulder to shoulder. And dinner was some questionable stew that had been boiling since the last full moon. Privacy, none. Clean sheets. You're funny. Even nobles didn't have it much better. Sure, they traveled with entourages, but that just meant more mouths to feed and more ways to attract attention. Castles and manors were far apart, so journeys took days or weeks. Letters could take months to arrive, assuming they weren't intercepted or lost in a puddle. Basically, Amazon Prime would have had a medieval meltdown. And don't forget diseases, pilgrimages, and fairs gathered people from across Europe. Which sounds nice, until you remember that germs love crowds. Travelers were basically walking plague couriers, bringing new and exciting illnesses to every town they passed through. So no, you wouldn't have survived medieval travel, unless, of course, you enjoyed mud, robbery, and bedbugs as part of your vacation package. Let's slowly wander now into another corner of medieval life that sounds grand on paper, but was, in reality, a total nightmare. Castles. They look so majestic in postcards and fantasy films. Towering stone walls, noble halls, banners fluttering in the breeze. But if you actually had to live in one, you'd hate it. First off, castles were cold. Stone walls don't exactly hold heat, and fireplaces only warmed a tiny area. Drafts seeped through cracks, floors froze, and everyone slept bundled in layers of scratchy wool. In winter, your breath literally misted in front of your face. Indoors, cozy. Then there was the smell. Castles didn't have modern plumbing. Instead, they had garderobes, basically medieval toilets. Holes in the wall where waste dropped down into pits or directly outside. Imagine an entire fortress full of people all using those. The stench lingered everywhere, mixing with smoke from torches and the ever-present aroma of unwashed bodies. A royal banquet might look glamorous, but beneath the scent of roasted meat was a strong undertone of sewage. Castles also weren't particularly safe. Sure, they looked intimidating, but inside, accidents were constant. Open flames, rickety stairs, falling stones. Not to mention disease spreading through cramped halls. Rats loved castles. So did fleas, and with them came everyone's favorite visitor, plague. Daily life wasn't all that exciting either, unless you enjoyed endless ceremonies, gossip, and political scheming. Most nobles were trapped inside, waiting for news, waiting for wars, waiting for heirs. Entertainment was limited. A traveling minstrel, a feast, maybe a hunting trip if the weather allowed. Otherwise, a whole lot of boredom. And servants. They lived in even worse conditions. Jammed into tiny quarters, up before dawn, hauling water, scrubbing chamber pots, cooking in smoky kitchens that were basically fire hazards with walls. Glamorous castle life was really just a medieval version of surviving inside a giant stone fridge with bad plumbing. So yes, castles looked mighty from the outside, but on the inside, they were freezing, smelly, and full of vermin. Let's quietly shuffle now from stone walls into another grim medieval reality. Religion. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't just a part of life, it was life. You wouldn't last long under the constant weight of it. From the moment you were born, the church had a grip on you. Baptism, marriage, burial, all under their control. Sundays, mandatory church. Holy days, more church. Festivals. Guess what? Also church. And services weren't exactly thrilling. Hours of Latin chanting, incense smoke thick enough to choke on, and priests reminding you the hell was always just one sinful thought away. Very relaxing. Tithes were another joy. Everyone, from peasants to nobles, had to pay a chunk of their income to the church. Couldn't afford it. Too bad. God still needed his cut. And if you wanted forgiveness for your sins, well, indulgences were available for purchase. Imagine a celestial paywall. You sin, you pay, you get slightly fewer years in purgatory. Pilgrimages were popular too. People trudged hundreds of miles to see relics, bones of saints, scraps of cloth, sometimes suspicious objects that were probably just random junk, but they believed. If a splinter was said to be from the true cross, then that splinter became a sacred magnet for thousands of weary feet. Germs, of course, came along for the ride. And then there was fear. Fear of hell, fear of demons, fear of witchcraft. People genuinely thought the devil was lurking around every corner. A bad harvest, Satan, a sick child, witchcraft, lightning struck your barn, clearly divine punishment. It must have been exhausting, living with constant paranoia that every sneeze was a spiritual crisis. Of course, the church itself wasn't always holy. Corruption, power struggles, and popes behaving more like kings than spiritual leaders were common. Some clergy lived lavishly, indulging in food, drink, and mistresses, while peasants starved below. But questioning the system, dangerous. You could be labeled a heretic, and being a heretic usually ended with firewood and a very short final sermon. So yes, religion gave structure, but it also smothered. You wouldn't last under the guilt, the rituals, and the endless fear of damnation. Let's drift now into another medieval reality. War. Spoiler, you wouldn't survive that, either. War in the Middle Ages. Sounds heroic in legends. Knights charging, banners flying, trumpets blaring, but in reality, you'd be lucky to survive 5 minutes. For starters, battles weren't daily events. Most of the time, wars dragged on for years with long stretches of waiting. Sieges, skirmishes, starvation. A siege meant sitting inside a castle while your food rotted, your water ran out, and disease spread like wildfire. Outside, armies camped in mud, waiting, also starving, also sick. Very glamorous. Actual combat was brutal. Forget the shiny Hollywood armor. Real armor was heavy, hot, and exhausting. Knights trained from childhood to even function in it You'd collapse halfway through putting on the helmet. And weapons. Swords weren't light, elegant sticks. They were hefty slabs of metal. Swinging one for more than a few minutes took strength most modern arms couldn't manage. And here's the thing. Most people in war weren't knights. They were peasants, handed a spear or bow, shoved into the field, and told good luck. No training, no glory, just a short life expectancy. Arrows rained down, horses trampled men, and anyone unlucky enough to fall usually got finished off in the mud. Then there were diseases in camp: dysentery, typhus, plague. More soldiers died from bad food and dirty water than from enemy swords. Picture thousands of men crammed into tents, eating half-eaten meat, drinking contaminated water, and sharing fleas. You didn't need an enemy to kill you. Your own army did the job. And the aftermath: villages burned, crops destroyed, peasants slaughtered. For civilians, war meant losing everything: food, family, home. No one was safe, and rebuilding could take decades. So no, medieval war wasn't noble or glorious. It was endless hunger, filth, and pain. You wouldn't have lasted a single campaign. Let's quietly drift now into another so-called cornerstone of medieval life: justice. Spoiler: it was as unfair as everything else. Justice in the Middle Ages sounds noble on parchment: laws, courts, trials. But in practice, you wouldn't stand a chance. For peasants, justice was mostly about who had more power. If your neighbor stole your cow, you could technically complain to the local lord. But if that neighbor was friends with the bailiff, or if you couldn't afford the legal fees, guess what? Goodbye, cow. The system was less rule of law and more rule of whoever owned the sharpest sword. Trials, when they happened, weren't exactly fair either. Sometimes guilt was decided by ordeal. Think, carrying a red-hot iron bar for a few steps. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were innocent. If not, guilty. Or maybe you were tossed into water with your hands tied. If you floated, you were guilty, because obviously, the water rejected you. If you sank, congratulations, you were innocent, but also drowned. Justice served. Nobles, of course, had different standards. A noble accused of a crime might get trial by combat. Essentially, fight it out and let God decide. Which was great if you were a strong knight. Less great if you were, say, a frail old man accused of treason. Punishments were public, designed less for fairness and more for entertainment. Stocks, pillories, whipping posts, all right in the town square. People jeered, threw rotten food, sometimes stones. Executions drew crowds to hanging, beheading, burning, all treated like medieval reality TV. Families brought their kids, vendors sold snacks. Because, apparently, nothing said family outing like watching someone get disemboweled. Even small crimes could earn brutal sentences. Steal bread, lose a hand, gossip about the wrong noble, maybe a flogging, accused of witchcraft. Good luck. Evidence wasn't necessary. Fear was enough. So no, you wouldn't last in medieval justice. Innocence wasn't protection. Fairness wasn't guaranteed. And survival usually depended on bribes or powerful friends. Let's slip now into another everyday struggle. Medieval work life. Spoiler: it was exhausting, endless, and usually unrewarded. Work in the Middle Ages wasn't a job you clocked in and out of. It was your life, every waking moment, sunrise to sunset. And for peasants, that usually meant farming, which sounds peaceful until you realize medieval farming tools made modern gardening shovels look advanced. Wooden plows that barely scratched the soil, sickles that dulled fast, and oxen that were stubborn, slow, and occasionally just sat down in the mud and refused to move. A peasant's year was one long calendar of backbreaking tasks. Spring meant planting, summer meant weeding and repairing, autumn meant harvesting. Winter, which you might think of as downtime, was just repairing tools, mending clothes, hauling firewood, and trying not to freeze. There were no weekends, no vacations. The closest thing to time off were church feast days, which sound fun. Until you remember, that's when you had to drag yourself to mass for hours. Nobles, on the other hand, had work to, except theirs was hunting, falconry, and managing estates. Managing usually meant yelling at stewards and occasionally riding around to look impressive. Hunting was considered both a sport and a way to practice military skills. But even that could go wrong. Plenty of nobles died falling off horses or being gored by boars. One French king even died from smashing into a tree during a joust, which really shows the hazards of fun in medieval times. Craftsmen and merchants had it rough in their own way. Guild rules were strict, apprenticeships lasted years, and pay wasn't great. Blacksmiths worked over hot fires all day. Bakers had to start before dawn. Tanners spent their lives ankle-deep in foul-smelling animal skins. Nobody had it easy, just different shades of hard. And through it all, disease, injury, or famine could wipe out everything you worked for in an instant. There was no safety net. If you broke a leg or had a bad harvest, you and your family could be finished. So yes, if you think your 9 to 5 is soul-crushing, medieval work would have you crying before noon. Now, let's wander into something less backbreaking, but equally unpleasant. Medieval fashion. Spoiler, you probably wouldn't have looked good in it either. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't about looking good, it was about showing status. Which is ironic, because most of it made people look like uncomfortable potatoes wrapped in itchy fabric. For peasants, clothes were practical. In the loosest sense, wool was the main fabric, rough and scratchy, dyed in dull browns and grays. Washing wasn't frequent, so clothes carried the scent of sweat, smoke, and whatever your daily job threw at you. Most people owned maybe 1 or 2 outfits total, patched until they were practically more patched than fabric. Nobles got the fun end of the deal. If you call fun lugging around 20 pounds of velvet and fur in the summer, layers upon layers, long trailing sleeves, hoods, veils, belts, and shoes with pointy toes, so exaggerated you could trip over them walking across the hall. Fashion was a flex. The longer your sleeves, the richer you looked, because obviously you weren't doing manual labor. Of course, this also meant dragging those sleeves through mud, candle wax, or even your dinner. But hey, style comes first, and colors mattered. Bright dyes were expensive, so wearing red, deep blue, or golden yellow was basically screaming, "I'm rich, please rob me." Sumptuary laws even restricted who could wear what. If you were a peasant rocking a fancy color, you could get fined, because heaven forbid the social order looked less obvious. Undergarments, not much to brag about. Linen shirts and shifts were the closest thing to underwear, rarely changed, and often shared between family members. Socks were rough, wool. Shoes were leather, stiff and uncomfortable, and rarely lasted long. And hygiene. Imagine sweating under heavy fabrics. No deodorant, no regular bathing. Perfumes existed, but only for the wealthy, and usually just made you smell like roses layered over manure. So if you picture yourself as a dazzling knight or elegant lady, just remember, you'd be itchy, sweaty, and constantly worried about stepping in mud with shoes that cost as much as a cow. Now, since we've dressed you in medieval layers, let us take you to the next logical step, the absolute joy that was medieval hygiene and bathing. Spoiler, bring your strongest nose. Hygiene in medieval times. Well, let's just say you wouldn't want to sit too close to anyone. People often imagine the Middle Ages as 1,000 years of everyone refusing to bathe. But the truth is more complicated, and still not exactly pleasant. Bathing did exist. Public bathhouses were surprisingly common in cities, at least early on. You could pay a small fee, soak in warm water, and maybe even get some food while you were at it. Sounds cozy, right? The problem, bathhouses gradually developed a reputation. Let us just say, more steamy activities went on than just steam. By the later Middle Ages, the church cracked down on them, and plagues didn't help either. Public bathing became suspicious, even dangerous, and eventually, it fizzled out. At home, most people made do with quick washes. A basin of cold water in the morning, maybe a little more if it was a feast day. Linen underclothes helped by soaking up sweat, and those got washed a bit more often. But for peasants, who only had 1 or 2 outfits anyway, keeping clean wasn't the priority. survival was. Toilets. If you're squeamish, you might want to skip this bit. Castles sometimes had garderobes, basically stone seats built into walls, with a chute dropping waste straight down into a pit or moat. Imagine being the poor guy cleaning that up. Towns had cesspits and chamber pots, emptied out into the street when full, and yes, that meant people walking down narrow streets were often dodging human waste along with mud. Shoes with long, pointy tips suddenly make more sense. Teeth weren't brushed the way we know today. People used cloths, twigs, or powders made from crushed herbs and chalk. Dental care was, let's say, limited. Toothaches often meant tooth removal, and medieval dentistry was essentially grab it with pliers and hope for the best. So, between rare baths, crowded towns, open sewage, and questionable dental routines, it wasn't exactly a world of minty freshness. Perfumes, herbs, and flowers were often used just to mask the stench. And speaking of stench, let us take a soft step into the next unavoidable part of medieval life. The homes and living spaces people actually inhabited. Spoiler, they were not cozy cottages from fairy tales. When you picture a medieval home, you might think of warm wooden beams, a crackling fireplace, and maybe a loaf of bread cooling on the table. Reality was colder, smokier, and far less charming. For peasants, the typical house was a single-room hut. Walls made of wattle and daub, basically sticks plastered with mud and straw. Roofs thatched with reeds, prone to leaking and home to more bugs than you'd ever want to think about. Windows, if you could even call them that, were just holes covered with shutters or animal skins. Glass, forget it. That was for cathedrals and the oak-rich. Inside, you had dirt floors, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. These were changed occasionally, but mostly they just absorbed everything. Food scraps, spills, and wastes from animals that often shared the space. Imagine the smell of a barn, mixed with cooking smoke, that had nowhere to go because chimneys were rare. The fire was in the middle of the room, and the smoke simply drifted upward, or sideways, or into your lungs. Cozy. Furniture was minimal. A table, some stools, maybe a chest. Beds, if you had one, were straw mattresses crawling with lice and fleas. Whole families often slept together for warmth, sometimes even with livestock nearby. Privacy, a completely modern concept. Noble homes, of course, were bigger, but not always better. Castles were drafty stone fortresses. Impressive from the outside, freezing on the inside. Heating relied on fireplaces that barely warmed a corner, leaving the rest of the hall icy. Tapestries helped, but they were mostly there to show off wealth. Bedchambers often had curtains around the bed, not just for privacy, but to trap at least a little warmth. And then there were the smells. Between poor sanitation, smoke-filled halls, and crowded quarters, Home Sweet Home was often more like home, slightly less miserable than outside. Still, compared to the wilderness, it was shelter. And that was enough. Now, since we've settled into the house, let's look at what people actually ate once they sat down at those rough tables. And here's a spoiler. Your medieval dinner menu would not land any Michelin stars. Food in medieval times depended almost entirely on who you were. Class decided your menu more than appetite ever could. For peasants, meals were simple, repetitive, and heavy. Bread was the foundation. Coarse, dark loaves made from rye or barley. Wheat bread was a luxury most villagers never tasted. Porridge, called pottage, was the go-to dish, a bubbling stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables or scraps of meat you could throw in. Meat was rare for the lower classes. Maybe pork if a family slaughtered a pig, or salted fish if you lived near water. Dairy, eggs, onions, cabbage, and turnips filled out most meals. Fresh fruit was seasonal and often eaten straight from trees or hedges, not in fancy pies. And sugar, that was so expensive it may as well have been fairy dust. Honey was the main sweetener when you could find it. Nobles, though, turned eating into theater. Banquets were about excess. whole roasted swans and peacocks brought to the table, sometimes redressed in their feathers for dramatic effect. Exotic spices like cinnamon, saffron, and pepper were status symbols, imported from faraway lands at ridiculous prices. Meat was everywhere. Venison, beef, pork, game birds. Fish dishes were plentiful too, especially on church-mandated fasting days, when red meat was forbidden. But here's the catch. Refrigeration didn't exist. Salt, vinegar, and smoking were the only ways to preserve food. That means a lot of what you ate was heavily salted, dried, or just on the edge of spoiling. And food safety, let's just say stomach aches, were a medieval tradition. Drinks were no better. Water wasn't always safe, especially in towns, so people drank weak ale, cider, or watered-down wine daily. Even children, morning milk, only if the cows hadn't already been tapped for butter and cheese. So, whether you were a peasant gnawing stale bread or a lord chewing through oversalted venison, your meals weren't exactly five-star experiences. They filled your stomach, but rarely left you feeling satisfied. And once the food was eaten, well, then came the real medieval challenge. What to do about your teeth and stomach after years of this delightful diet. Health in the Middle Ages was fragile at best. The average life expectancy hovered somewhere in the 30s. Though that number's misleading. Plenty of people lived longer if they survived childhood. But disease, famine, and accidents were always waiting around the corner. Medicine was a mix of half-understood science, superstition, and a lot of guesswork. The core theory was the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, doctors believed one of these was out of balance. The solution: bleeding, purging, or making you vomit. Because nothing says healing like losing half your blood into a bowl. Barber surgeons handled a lot of the hands-on work. Yes, barbers, the same people who cut your hair, might also amputate your leg. Surgery was done without anesthesia, and antiseptics weren't really a thing. Wine or vinegar might be poured on wounds, but infection was common. And if you think dental care is bad now, imagine someone yanking out teeth with pliers while you're held down by friends. Midwives, herbalists, and folk healers were often more effective than trained physicians. They relied on plants like garlic, willow bark, or mint, and while not perfect, at least they didn't drain you of blood for a headache. Still, anyone offering remedies outside the church-approved system risked being labeled suspicious, or worse, accused of witchcraft. Hospitals existed, but they weren't primarily for curing. They were more like places of charity, offering shelter and prayers rather than medical miracles. Wealthy patients might afford private care at home, but the results weren't much better. And of course, looming over everything were epidemics. Leprosy, dysentery, tuberculosis, and the plague swept through populations with terrifying ease. A bad harvest could lead to famine, weakening entire villages. Life was a gamble, and health was a fragile thread, always threatening to snap. So yes, you wouldn't last long in medieval medicine's hands. The cure was often as dangerous as the illness. And while we're already feeling queasy, let's drift into the next grim reality. Medieval childbirth and childhood. Spoiler, it wasn't a fairy tale start to life. Childbirth in medieval times was one of the most perilous moments of a woman's life. No matter your status, the risks were enormous. Infection, hemorrhage, or complications that today would be solved with a simple hospital procedure often meant death for both mother and child. It was so common that many women wrote their wills when they became pregnant. Midwives oversaw most births, armed with experience, herbs, and prayers. They used remedies like warm compresses, scented herbs, and charms to ease the pain. Physicians were rarely involved unless something went very wrong, and even then, their options were limited. Pain relief, forget it. At best, you might get a sip of ale, a whispered prayer, or a chunk of wood to bite down on. For noblewomen, childbirth was both a duty and a curse. Their primary role was producing heirs, and many spent their short lives in a cycle of pregnancy and recovery. Some queens and princesses bore 10 or more children, only to see most of them die in infancy. Even wealth and access to the best care couldn't protect them. And once a baby was born, Survival was hardly guaranteed. Infant mortality rates were staggering. A third, sometimes half, of children didn't live past age 5. Diseases, malnutrition, and accidents claimed lives quickly. Naming a child was often delayed until baptism, because parents feared getting attached before they knew the baby would survive. Childhood itself was short. From the age of 7, many children were already working, in the fields, as apprentices, or in noble households. Education was a luxury, mostly reserved for boys of wealthy families, or those destined for the church. Play existed, but often with homemade toys, rough games, and simple amusements. Childhood wasn't a long period of carefree innocence. It was a short prelude to labor and responsibility. Still, families found joy where they could. Songs, stories, and festivals gave children moments of light in an otherwise uncertain world. But the reality remained. Being born in medieval times was one of the biggest risks you'd ever take. Now that we've entered life itself, let us gently wander into what shaped that life every single day. The rhythms of medieval religion and belief. Religion wasn't just part of medieval life. It was the air people breathed. The church shaped everything, from how you were born, to how you lived, to how you died. Faith wasn't private or optional. It was woven into the rhythm of every single day. The bells of the local church dictated time itself. Morning prayers, midday mass, evening vespers. Life moved according to these sacred hours. Even the calendar was more about feast days and saints' days than anything else. People didn't say, "See you in April." They said, "See you after Easter." For peasants, faith was both comfort and obligation. You tithed a tenth of what you produced to the church, even if you could barely feed your family. Attendance at services was expected, and missing Mass wasn't just frowned upon. It could be considered a sin. Yet the church was also the heart of the community. It was where you marked births, marriages, deaths, and where you came together during famines or disasters. For nobles, religion was a matter of politics as much as piety. Patronizing monasteries, funding churches, or going on crusade wasn't only about saving your soul. It was about power, reputation, and influence. Kings argued with popes, bishops controlled lands like feudal lords, and monasteries became centers of wealth that rivaled castles. Belief in the supernatural was constant. Saints were called upon for protection. Relics were treasured for their supposed power, and every village had its local holy figure to turn to. At the same time, people feared demons, witches, and curses. A sudden illness or bad harvest might be blamed on sin, sorcery, or divine punishment. And confession hung over everyone. The idea that your sins were recorded and had to be cleansed weighed heavily. Death wasn't just the end of life. It was the doorway to eternal judgment, and the church made sure you never forgot it. So yes, medieval life wasn't just hard labor and poor hygiene. It was also constant prayer, ritual, and an underlying fear of eternal damnation if you slipped up. And speaking of slipping up, let's quietly drift into the next reality. Medieval justice and punishment. Spoiler, it was as brutal as the workday, but somehow even less fair. Justice in the Middle Ages was a curious mix of ritual, superstition, and outright cruelty. Forget about fair trials and neatly filed paperwork. Guilt or innocence was often decided less by evidence and more by spectacle. For peasants, village disputes were handled locally. Maybe the Lord's steward, maybe the town elders. If someone stole a chicken or broke a fence, the punishment could be a fine, public shaming, or something more physical, stocks, pillories, or a beating. Public humiliation was a favorite tool, because nothing says "Don't do it again" like being pelted with rotten vegetables by your neighbors. But for more serious crimes, theft, treason, witchcraft, heresy, things escalated quickly. Trials by ordeal were one method. Imagine being told to stick your hand in boiling water or carry hot iron, and if your wounds healed cleanly, you were innocent. If they festered, well, clearly God had judged you guilty. Or how about being tossed into a river? If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank and drowned, congratulations, you were innocent, but dead. Nobles, of course, got different treatment. They might face trial by combat, literally fighting your accuser to prove God favored the righteous, which worked fine if you were strong and skilled, not so much if you were a scrawny, bookish type. Highborn criminals might also get beheaded, which was considered more dignified than hanging. Punishments were designed to be seen. Executions were public events, meant as warnings. Hangings, burnings, beheadings, all carried out before crowds. Even lesser crimes had theatrical punishments, like branding or ear cropping, so everyone could see your past mistakes stamped on your body. The law wasn't just about crime, either. The church had its own courts for sins, like adultery, blasphemy, or failing to fast properly. You could end up doing penance for something as small as skipping mass. In other words, sin and crime blurred together. So justice in medieval times wasn't really about fairness. It was about keeping order through fear, ritual, and a hefty dose of divine judgment. Now, since we've survived the courtroom and scaffold, let's ease into something a little less terrifying, but still strange: medieval leisure and entertainment. Because yes, even in all that misery, people did find ways to have fun. Life in the Middle Ages was hard, but even the most overworked peasant or anxious noble needed a little distraction. Entertainment wasn't just for the rich. Everyone, in their own way, found moments to laugh, play, or celebrate. For peasants, leisure usually tied in with festivals and holy days, and luckily, the church calendar provided plenty of them. These weren't quiet affairs. Think feasting, drinking, singing, and dancing in the village square. Games like wrestling, tug of war, or simple ball games gave people a chance to blow off steam. Music was everywhere too, often with bagpipes, fiddles, or drums. And yes, some of the songs were bawdy enough to make a modern pub blush. Nobles entertained themselves differently. Hunting was the ultimate pastime, not just for food, but as a display of skill and dominance. Falconry, jousting, and tournaments were more than games. They were social events, blending sport with prestige. Imagine knights crashing into each other with lances while the crowd cheered and nobles placed wagers. It was half sport, half political theater. Theatrical performances also flourished, especially religious plays. Mystery plays told biblical stories, acted out in town squares with costumes and props. They weren't subtle. Devils wore horns and tails, angels had wings strapped on, and plenty of humor snuck in alongside the preaching. For common folk, it was both spiritual and entertaining. Inside castles, nobles enjoyed music, poetry, and storytelling. Troubadours and minstrels traveled from court to court, singing songs of chivalry, romance, and occasionally scandal. Board games like chess were popular among the elite, while dice games tempted both nobles and peasants alike, sometimes to the despair of priests who condemned gambling as sinful. And, of course, drinking was a universal pastime. Alehouses in towns were gathering spots where gossip, singing, and brawls flowed as freely as the beer. So yes, the Middle Ages weren't just endless misery. People laughed, played, and even made space for joy. But speaking of joy, let's move to the flip side. The darker mood that constantly haunted medieval life, the looming presence of death. Because if anything shaped the medieval mindset, it was the awareness that death was never far away. In the Middle Ages, death was never far away. Plagues, famine, wars, childbirth, infections, all could cut a life short without warning. People didn't avoid the subject of death. They lived alongside it, planned for it, and in many ways, expected it. The church kept the afterlife at the center of daily thought. Heaven, hell, and purgatory weren't abstract ideas. They were vivid, terrifying realities. Art reminded you constantly. Murals of skeletons, carvings of demons dragging souls, paintings of the Last Judgment. Even graveyards were often in the center of villages, right next to the church. So every Sunday Mass was also a reminder of your own mortality. Funerals were communal affairs. The body was washed, wrapped, and carried to the church. Bells tolled, prayers were said, and burial followed, often in simple shrouds. Nobles, of course, had grand tombs, carved effigies, and masses sung for their souls for years after death. But the underlying fear was the same for everyone. Would you make it to heaven, or would your sins drag you elsewhere? The obsession with death gave rise to haunting imagery. The danse macabre, or dance of death, was a common theme in art and literature. Skeletons leading people of all classes to the grave, a reminder that death spared no one. Kings, peasants, bishops, beggars, all equal in the end. Children grew up surrounded by this awareness. Siblings might die young, parents might be lost suddenly. The grief was real, but so was the acceptance. Life was fragile, and death was part of the cycle. In a way, this closeness to mortality made medieval people more comfortable with the idea than we are today. And when death struck in epidemic waves, like the Black Death, it changed everything. Not just families, but entire societies. Fear of divine punishment, panic about witches or sinners, and a collective trauma that reshaped Europe for centuries. So, while we like to think of the Middle Ages as grim, for the people living through it, death wasn't shocking. It was expected, daily, woven into the rhythm of existence. And since we've slipped into the graveyard, let's step softly into the plague pits themselves, the horrors of medieval disease, with the Black Death leading the way. It began quietly in the 1340s, creeping along trade routes from Asia into Europe. At first, it was whispers of sickness. Ships docking at ports brought not only silk, spices, and grain, but something invisible, carried by fleas, living on rats. When the plague arrived, it struck like a hammer. Within days, victims developed painful swellings, buboes in their armpits and groins, fever, vomiting, blackened skin, and then death. Whole families were wiped out in a week. Towns and villages fell silent, their streets empty, their houses locked from the outside to keep disease contained. People panicked. Some believed it was God's punishment for sin. Others blamed bad air or miasma floating invisibly through the streets. And some turned their fear against minorities, particularly Jewish communities, accusing them of poisoning wells, leading to horrific massacres. Priests carried out last rites as quickly as they could, but even the clergy were dying. Graveyards overflowed in some places. Bodies were piled in mass pits, sprinkled with lime, and covered with thin layers of dirt. Bells tolled endlessly until there was no one left to ring them. The scale was beyond comprehension. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died. Entire villages vanished from the map. Farmland lay empty, houses abandoned, trade ground to a halt, and fear clung to every survivor. And yet, the world didn't end. When the wave finally passed, society had changed. With so many dead peasants, suddenly had more leverage. Landowners needed workers, and wages rose. The rigid feudal order cracked. The church, too, faced criticism. Many wondered why prayers hadn't stopped the plague, but the memory of it never faded. For centuries afterward, art, stories, and sermons carried the echo of the Black Death, a reminder of how fragile life was, and how quickly the world could be turned upside down. And the plague didn't vanish after the 1340s. It returned in waves, smaller outbreaks, again and again, for generations. Each time fear rose again. Each time, the memory of mass death resurfaced. Still, not all medieval sicknesses were as dramatic. Fevers, dysentery, leprosy, these too haunted daily life, stealing lives slowly and quietly. The medieval world was a fragile body, always one step away from collapse. But let's not stay in the sick room too long. From the ashes of plague and loss, let's drift into something brighter. The strange, surprising world of medieval festivals and celebrations, where joy and chaos filled the streets, even when death lingered nearby. Life in the Middle Ages was hard. Cold winters, endless work, and the constant shadow of illness. But even then, people carved out moments of joy. Festivals weren't just entertainment. They were survival for the spirit. The biggest celebrations, of course, revolved around the church calendar. Christmas and Easter weren't just religious days. They were explosions of food, drink, and song. Imagine a small village where most days were dull and repetitive. Suddenly, The church bells rang for a holy day, and everyone dropped their tools. Tables were dragged into the square, food was shared, and someone inevitably brought out a drum or a fiddle. Carnival was perhaps the strangest of them all. It happened before Lent, that long, dreary season of fasting and penance. So Carnival was a last gasp of indulgence. People wore masks, danced through the streets, and mocked authority. Servants dressed as nobles, nobles dressed as fools. And for one delicious day, the rules of the world were flipped upside down. Another favorite was the Feast of Fools. Clergy, who were usually expected to act with solemn dignity, would parody their own rituals. They wore animal masks, brayed like donkeys, and turned the church into something resembling a comedy stage. The higher clergy disapproved, of course, but the people loved it. Sometimes, laughter was as holy as prayer. There were harvest festivals, too. After months of grueling labor in the fields, villagers came together to celebrate survival. Ale flowed freely, bonfires were lit. Young people danced in circles, sometimes sneaking off into the shadows for their own private celebrations. But not all festivals were wholesome. Drinking often went too far. Fights broke out, and behind the masks and music, there was always a reminder that tomorrow meant going back to work, to poverty, to the grind. These bursts of joy were fragile, fleeting, but they mattered. They made the hardships bearable. Even kings and queens loved their feasts. Royal banquets were spectacles of power. Imagine long tables groaning under roasted boars, spiced pies, sugared almonds, and fountains of wine. Music filled the halls, jesters performed, and the smell of roasted meat clung to the air. Of course, the peasants weren't invited, but outside, in their own rough way, the common folk held their smaller versions of the same joy. Festivals reminded everyone that life, though brief and bitter, could still be sweet for a moment. And with that taste of joy lingering, let's quietly step toward another corner of medieval life, education and learning, where monks, manuscripts, and a whole lot of candlelight shaped the way people thought. If you were a child in medieval Europe, your chances of getting an education were slim. For most, life meant working the fields, tending animals, or learning a trade. Reading and writing were luxuries, and books, well, books were rarer than gold. But not everyone lived in ignorance. The church guarded knowledge like a dragon hoards treasure. Monasteries were the keepers of learning, where monks spent their days copying manuscripts by hand. Imagine it, rows of men hunched over desks, quills scratching slowly across parchment, hour after hour, year after year. One slip of the pen, and the whole page might be ruined. A monastery library wasn't huge by modern standards. Maybe 100 books, if they were lucky. But in an age when a single book could take months to copy, that was a treasure chest of knowledge. Most texts were in Latin, the language of the church. If you couldn't read Latin, well, too bad. The medieval classroom wasn't exactly big on inclusivity. For children who did study, lessons were often brutal. Grammar schools taught Latin by drilling it endlessly. Teachers used sticks to enforce discipline. If you didn't memorize your declensions, you felt it on your back. Learning was less about curiosity and more about obedience. Universities, when they began to emerge in places like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, were chaotic and exciting. Students were usually young men, sometimes as young as 14, who traveled from far away to cram into cold lecture halls. Professors read aloud from the few precious books, while students scribbled notes. There was little discussion, little creativity, just repetition and commentary on ancient authorities like Aristotle. Still, the universities were a revolution. They created communities of learning that stretched across Europe. A student from England could sit beside one from Spain, both listening to the same dusty lecture. Latin bound them together, a common tongue of scholarship, and education wasn't only about books. Apprenticeships trained boys, and sometimes girls, in trades like blacksmithing, weaving, or medicine. Learning by doing, rather than by reading. Knowledge wasn't just in the monasteries. It was in the workshops, the kitchens, and the guild halls. Of course, education reinforced hierarchy. A noble's son might study letters to prepare for governance. A peasant's son would learn to plow. A noble's daughter might be taught to read prayers, while a peasant's daughter learned to milk cows. Different paths, carefully separated. But even in this rigid system, the seeds of curiosity were alive. Slowly, painfully, medieval Europe was laying the groundwork for something bigger. The intellectual blossoming that would come centuries later. For now, though, most learning stayed locked away, flickering in the dim light of monastery scriptoria. And from this world of ink and candle smoke, let's drift into something more dangerous. The medieval legal system, with its ordeals, trials, and often absurd attempts at justice. Justice in the Middle Ages was, let's say, creative. Forget neat courtrooms, powdered wigs, or calm judges. Instead, picture muddy village squares, shouting crowds, and a priest holding a crucifix, while everyone waited to see if God would reveal the truth. If you were accused of a crime, evidence wasn't the main thing. Witnesses, sure, but often people relied on something called trial by ordeal. An ordeal really was the right word. One method involved plunging your hand into boiling water. If your skin healed cleanly after a few days, you were innocent. If it festered, well, guilty. Another ordeal was trial by cold water. The accused was tied up and tossed into a river or pond, if they sank. Innocent if they floated. Guilty, because floating meant that pure water had rejected them. It was, essentially, a lose-lose scenario, unless you were a really good sinker. Then there were ordeals by fire. Walking barefoot across hot iron, or carrying red-hot metal in your hands. If you survived without burns, God was clearly on your side. And yes, people actually believed this proved something. By the late Middle Ages, ordeals started to fade, replaced by more organized courts. But organized is relative. Nobles had different courts than peasants. The wealthy could sometimes pay fines instead of suffering harsher punishments. And of course, everything leaned heavily in favor of whoever had power. Punishments were often public, not just to punish the guilty, but to put on a show. Stocks in the village square held people by their arms and necks, while passers-by jeered, tossed rotten food, or worse, floggings drew crowds. Executions were almost festival-like, with whole communities gathering to watch. For serious crimes, there was hanging. In some places, beheading. And for those unlucky enough to be caught in accusations of heresy, well, burning at the stake became the grim finale. The point wasn't just to punish, but to remind everyone else, step out of line, and this could be you. Fear was as much a tool of justice as truth. Yet medieval law wasn't always cruel. There were also fines, oaths, and arbitration. Local lords or councils tried to settle disputes without blood, but make no mistake, the medieval justice system was more about maintaining order than finding truth. And hovering around it all was the church, blending faith with law. Confessions, penance, and oaths on relics tied the legal world to the spiritual one. To be guilty in court was often the same as being guilty in the eyes of God. From here, let's quietly shift our gaze again. Justice was harsh, but so was everyday survival. Let's wander into the world of crime, bandits, and outlaws. The darker underbelly of medieval life. For every law, there was someone ready to break it. Medieval Europe was no stranger to thieves, conmen, and outlaws. And while some were desperate peasants stealing to survive, others were bold enough to turn crime into a profession. Bandits were a constant threat, especially along roads that cut through forests. Picture a weary merchant traveling with a cart of goods, only to be stopped by a group of men with knives, demanding everything. It happened so often that travelers sometimes hired armed escorts, or joined up in groups for safety. Roads weren't lonely. They were dangerous. The romantic idea of the noble outlaw, like Robin Hood, does have some roots in reality. Outlaws were literally outside the law. Once declared an outlaw, you had no legal protection. Anyone could rob you, attack you, or even kill you without punishment. Some hid in the woods, forming small gangs, living off theft and extortion. Villagers might secretly support them, especially if they targeted wealthy lords who taxed them unfairly. But just as often, outlaws preyed on the poor as much as the rich. Petty crime was everywhere. Pickpockets at markets, thieves slipping into barns at night to steal chickens, workers sneaking tools from workshops. Punishments could be harsh even for small thefts. Losing a hand for stealing bread wasn't unheard of. And yet, hunger kept people taking risks. Cities had their own underworlds. Brothels operated in shadowy corners, sometimes tolerated, sometimes raided. Gambling dens thrived, along with taverns where brawls could break out over spilled ale. The larger the city, the more complicated the crime. Gangs of young men roamed at night, armed with clubs, picking fights. There were also white-collar medieval crimes. Counterfeiting coins was a favorite, easy to do if you had access to metals. Forging documents, too, especially in places where literacy was rare and seals were the only proof of authority. A fake seal could open doors, or start wars. And of course, there were crimes tied to superstition, accusations of witchcraft, sorcery, or cons involving charms and potions. Some made a living selling supposed cures, love spells, or protective amulets. Were they frauds? Sometimes, but in a world desperate for hope, people were willing to pay. The line between crime and survival blurred constantly. A starving farmer stealing grain wasn't the same as a nobleman embezzling taxes, yet both were treated as lawbreakers. Justice didn't always see the difference. So the streets were never entirely safe. Bandits lurked on roads, thieves prowled in towns, and behind every locked chest or barred door was the quiet knowledge that someone, somewhere, wanted what you had. Now, from crime and outlaws, let's drift to another part of daily medieval reality: money, markets, and the rise of trade, where fortune and failure were two sides of the same coin. If there was one place that truly buzzed with life in the Middle Ages, it was the market square. Picture a muddy clearing in the center of town, stalls set up under rough cloth awnings, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat, damp wool, and too many bodies crammed close together. Chickens flapped underfoot, children darted through the crowd, and merchants shouted themselves hoarse, trying to lure customers with promises that their onions were fresher, their cloth finer, their bread whiter. Markets were lifelines. For peasants, this was where surplus crops could be sold, or where they could buy salt, tools, or fabric. For townsfolk, it was where gossip spread faster than news, and where every deal was sealed with a handshake, or sometimes with a fistfight. Money was changing, too. Early on, barter was common: a basket of eggs for a hunk of cheese, a day's labor for a pair of shoes. But as trade networks grew, coins became essential. Silver pennies in England, deniers in France, florins in Italy. Each region minted its own currency, which made cross-border trade a headache. Merchants needed money changers, men who sat at tables weighing coins, testing their purity, and of course, charging a fee for the service. And trade wasn't just local. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was tied into vast networks. Italian merchants brought spices, silks, and glassware from the east. Hanseatic traders sailed the North and Baltic seas, exchanging furs, timber, and fish. Markets grew into fairs, and fairs into international spectacles. The Champagne fairs in France, for instance, attracted merchants from across the continent. Of course, wealth attracted suspicion. The church frowned on usury, lending money at interest, calling it sinful. Yet everyone needed loans, so moneylenders, often marginalized communities like Jews who were barred from other professions, became crucial. This made them both necessary and tragically resented, a double-edged position in medieval society. Markets weren't just about trade, though; they were theater. Jugglers, musicians, and storytellers worked the crowd. Pickpockets blended in, waiting for a distracted hand to wander too close to a purse. And the town authorities watched it all carefully, collecting taxes and fees, making sure no one cheated too openly. For all their mud and chaos, markets were symbols of a changing world. They connected villages to towns, towns to cities, and cities to continents. They hinted at the beginnings of something bigger, a Europe slowly pulling itself out of isolation and into the currents of global trade. But markets weren't only about money. They also shaped culture, bringing together people, ideas, and sometimes trouble, which leads us, gently, into the next current of medieval life: art, music, and the strange beauty that echoed through stone cathedrals and smoky taverns alike. For all its mud and misery, the Middle Ages had moments of breathtaking creativity. Walk into a cathedral, and you'd be struck not only by the towering stone, but by the way sound filled the air. Music was everywhere, from the chanting of monks in cloisters to fiddlers playing for tips at taverns. Church music was the backbone. Gregorian chant, slow and solemn, rolled like waves in candlelit halls. It wasn't exactly catchy. No one was humming it on their way home, but it was designed to lift the soul, to make the listener feel small beneath the vastness of God. Later, polyphony developed, with multiple voices weaving together like threads. To medieval ears, it was mind-bending, strange, and heavenly. But outside church walls, music was looser. Minstrels wandered from town to town, singing songs of love, war, or gossip. Troubadours in southern France crafted poetry set to melody, often about courtly love, a highly idealized kind of romance where knights adored ladies from afar, writing songs about how perfect and unattainable they were. It was romantic, sure, but also slightly ridiculous. Art, too, had its own rhythm. Illuminated manuscripts were treasures, pages covered in gold leaf, bright paints, and tiny illustrations that curled in the margins. Sometimes these little drawings were holy, angels, saints, or decorative vines. But scribes also doodled strange creatures: snails fighting knights, rabbits wielding swords, monkeys playing bagpipes. Turns out even monks got bored. Then there was the great leap of stone and glass. Gothic cathedrals, soaring arches, ribbed vaults, and stained glass windows that bathed the interior in a kaleidoscope of color. Standing inside one, you couldn't help but feel small. And that was the point. Art was meant to inspire awe, to remind you of heaven, even if outside the doors was just another muddy street. In villages, art was simpler, but no less heartfelt. Carved wooden saints decorated chapels. Painted wall frescoes told Bible stories to those who couldn't read. And embroidered cloth brightened homes. Art was woven into everyday life, not locked away in galleries. And while medieval music and art often aimed to glorify God, they also revealed the human side: joy, humor, longing. Even in an age obsessed with the afterlife, people couldn't resist leaving behind little glimpses of themselves in song and color. From here, we can slip into yet another layer of medieval imagination: the myths, legends, and folklore that shaped how people saw the world, filling it with dragons, saints, and things that went bump in the night. The Middle Ages weren't just about plows and prayers. They were also an age of stories, whispered around fires, written in heavy books, painted into church walls. In a world where so much was uncertain, myths gave people a way to explain the unexplainable. Dragons were everywhere in medieval lore, not because anyone had actually seen one, but because they made great symbols. They stood for chaos, greed, sin, basically anything bad that needed slaying. Knights facing dragons weren't just fighting monsters. They were battling the darker parts of human nature. Of course, sometimes the stories skipped the moral lesson and just leaned into the fun of fire-breathing lizards. Then there were saints, legends. Lives of holy men and women were often written with more imagination than accuracy. Saints who tamed wolves, saints who fought demons, saints who survived decapitation only to calmly pick up their heads and walk away. These weren't meant to be realistic. They were spiritual metaphors. But to the average listener, they blurred right into everyday belief. Folklore bubbled up from the countryside too. Fairies, witches, and forest spirits lurked in the imagination of villagers. The woods at night weren't just dark. They were alive with unseen presences. People told stories to explain why crops failed, why children went missing, why someone fell mysteriously ill. A fairy curse, a witch's spell, a ghost that hadn't been properly laid to rest. And of course, there were the legendary heroes. King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Stories of chivalry, loyalty, and quests for the Holy Grail. Did Arthur exist? Probably not as the stories tell it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the ideal. A perfect king in a broken world. Legends weren't just entertainment. They shaped behavior. A boy who grew up hearing about brave saints or noble knights might dream of becoming one. A girl who heard stories of patient holy women might be inspired to endure hardship. Stories taught lessons, subtle or not, and gave people a sense that life was part of something bigger. And sometimes, myths just gave people a little escape when your daily reality was mud, hunger, and taxes. A tale about a knight slaying a dragon or a saint walking on water was a reminder that the world wasn't only dull suffering. There was magic somewhere, even if only in the mind. From these fireside stories and stained glass legends, let's drift into something a little more worldly. Knighthood, tournaments, and the oddly theatrical business of medieval chivalry. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often picture knights in shining armor. And yes, they existed, but the reality was more complicated and often less glamorous. Knighthood was supposed to be about honor, loyalty, and service. The so-called Code of Chivalry painted a picture of the perfect knight, brave in battle, courteous to women, faithful to God, and merciful to the weak. In theory, it was noble. In practice, well, knights could be just as greedy, violent, and self-serving as anyone else. But ideals have power, and this one stuck. Becoming a knight wasn't easy. Boys of noble families started young, first as pages learning manners, horsemanship, and the basics of weaponry. Then, as squires, they served the knight directly, polishing armor, carrying shields, and watching how battles were fought. If they survived adolescence without being trampled by a horse or skewered by accident, they might finally be knighted. Often in a solemn ceremony, with prayers and a tap of the sword on the shoulder. But once knighted, what did they do? War, when there was one. Otherwise, they trained, managed estates, or looked for ways to prove themselves. Enter the tournament. Tournaments were part sport, part training exercise, part rowdy festival. The most famous event was the joust, two knights charging at each other on horseback with lances, trying to unseat their opponent. It was dangerous, expensive, and loud. Splintering wood flew everywhere. Horses crashed, helmets dented. Occasionally, a knight was killed outright, but hey, that was part of the thrill. There were also melees, chaotic mock battles where groups of knights clashed in open fields. These could get even rougher than real war, since the point wasn't just to fight, but to show off. Winning brought prestige, prizes, and sometimes the admiration of noble ladies watching from the stands. Chivalry also demanded courtesy to women, or at least the performance of it. Knights dedicated victories to ladies fair, often married noble women they weren't actually supposed to be pursuing. It was all wrapped up in that elaborate game of courtly love, a mix of real desire, poetic exaggeration, and social rules, so tangled it's a wonder anyone knew what was going on. And of course, tournaments weren't just about knights. They were events for the whole community. Merchants set up stalls, musicians played, commoners crowded in to watch the spectacle. It was half war game, half fairground attraction. Still, beneath the pageantry, there was always the harsher truth. Knights weren't superheroes. They were part of a violent elite whose job was to fight, raid, and enforce power. The chivalric code softened their image, but reality often looked less like honor and more like armored thuggery from the glitter of the tournament field. Let's wander back into the quieter but equally strange world of food and dining, where medieval meals were feasts of flavor, superstition, and questionable hygiene. When we picture medieval food, we often imagine giant roasted turkeys, overflowing goblets of wine, and peasants gnawing on stale bread. And, sure, some of that is true. But the reality of medieval dining was a mix of luxury, scarcity, and sometimes just plain weird. For the peasants, meals were simple and repetitive. Bread was the backbone of the diet. Dark, coarse loaves made with rye, barley, or oats. To wash it down, there was ale. Not the strong, modern stuff, but a light, low-alcohol brew that was safer than water. A typical peasant meal might include a pottage, a kind of thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and maybe, just maybe, a sliver of meat, if you were lucky. Meat was rare for the poor, but not entirely absent. Pigs were common in villages, since they could forage for themselves. Chickens, too, provided eggs and occasional Sunday dinners. But for the most part, meat was something peasants saw only at festivals or feasts provided by their lords. For the nobility, things looked very different. The upper classes had access to venison, boar, swan, peacock, and even porpoise. Yes, porpoise. If it swam, flew, or ran, someone probably roasted it at a medieval banquet. Exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper were highly prized, shipped from faraway lands and worth their weight in silver. Using spices wasn't just about flavor. It was a status symbol, proof that you had money and connections. Banquets were theatrical affairs. Dishes were served in elaborate courses, often with strange surprises in between. Imagine a pie being cut open, and live birds flying out. Yes, that actually happened. Or brightly dyed jellies molded into castles and dragons. Food was entertainment as much as nourishment. But not everything was glamorous. Hygiene was, let's say, flexible. Forks weren't common until much later, so people ate with knives, spoons, and their fingers. Table manners existed, but not everyone followed them. Picture a crowded hall, greasy hands, dogs underfoot, and half a dozen smells competing in the air. As for drinks, water wasn't trusted. Ale and wine were the go-to beverages, even for children. The wealthy enjoyed sweetened wines and spiced brews. The poor had small beer, weak ale that quenched thirst without knocking you flat. One fascinating detail: fasting days. The church required Christians to avoid meat on certain days, which meant fish became hugely important. Not just fresh fish, but salted, dried, and pickled varieties that could last the winter. Monks especially relied on fish-heavy diets, though some monasteries got creative and classified things like beaver tails and barnacle geese as fish. Convenient loopholes, right? So, from rough bread in a peasant's hut to extravagant swan feasts in a lord's hall, food told the story of who you were in medieval society. And now, from the clatter of plates and the aroma of stews, let's drift into another part of daily life: medieval medicine, where cures could be comforting, bizarre, or downright terrifying. If you caught a cold in medieval times, you didn't exactly have the option to run down to the pharmacy for cough syrup. Instead, you had doctors, barber surgeons, apothecaries, midwives, monks, and a whole lot of guesswork. Medicine back then was built around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Your health was thought to depend on keeping these IV fluids perfectly balanced. Too much blood, you'd get leeches. Too much phlegm, well, expect purging or a round of laxatives. A fever might mean you were simply too hot, so treatment could involve cooling herbs, cold baths, or even shaved ice if you were lucky enough to have it. Leeches and bloodletting were surprisingly popular. The idea was that by letting out a little blood, you could restore balance. Sometimes it worked, mostly because fevers naturally break, not because a bowl of your blood was sitting on the table. Herbal medicine also played a huge role. Monks and monasteries kept gardens filled with healing plants: sage for sore throats, lavender for headaches, garlic for infections. Some of these remedies actually had benefits. But then you'd also find recipes like wear a toad around your neck to cure plague. Slightly less scientific. Speaking of plague, when the Black Death hit in the 14th century, medicine was completely overwhelmed. Doctors wore those iconic beaked masks, stuffed with herbs to filter the air. Treatments ranged from rubbing onions and herbs on boils, to burning aromatic woods, to straight-up flagellation, because maybe God was angry, and whipping yourself would help. Spoiler, it didn't. Surgery was rough, too. Anesthetics were basically non-existent. You might get a cup of strong wine or some poppy juice to dull the pain. But amputations and trepanations, yes. Drilling holes in skulls were done with little more than courage and screaming. Barber surgeons doubled as haircutters and tooth pullers, so you could get stitched up and styled in one sitting. Astrology often guided treatments. The position of the stars and moon supposedly influenced when to perform surgeries or take medicine. If Mars was in the wrong house, maybe you'd better wait a few days before cutting into that abscess. For women, childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments of life. Midwives did their best, using herbs and charms, but mortality rates were high. A difficult birth might call for prayers to saints, protective amulets, or even holy relics placed under the bed. So, medicine in the Middle Ages was a curious mix of helpful herbal wisdom, religious rituals, and practices that honestly made things worse. It's a reminder that people did their best with what they knew, but Dr. S. orders back then could be a little scarier than the illness itself. And from the smoky sikrams and chanting monks, let us wander to another corner of medieval life, the religion and superstition that shaped every waking hour. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't just Sunday service. It was the water you swam in, the air you breathed, and the laws you lived by. The church wasn't simply a building. It was the central authority, more powerful in many ways than kings and emperors. From the moment you were born, religion marked your life. Baptism came almost immediately, because infant mortality was high, and nobody wanted a soul stuck in limbo. Daily prayers, blessings, and feast days carried you through the seasons. And when you finally died, your soul's fate, heaven, hell, or purgatory, was the ultimate concern. The church calendar was crammed with holy days and fasts. Roughly a third of the year was spent abstaining from meat, which made fish a medieval superstar. And Sundays were sacred. Work was forbidden, markets closed, and bells rang out to remind you who really set the rules. Fear of sin weighed heavy. The idea of hell was vividly preached. Eternal flames, devils with pitchforks, endless torment. If that didn't scare you into confession, nothing would. Purgatory was like the church's middle ground. Not heaven, not hell, but a sort of fiery waiting room where you could burn off your lesser sins before eventually making it upward. To help avoid that fate, people turned to saints. Saints were like spiritual celebrities. Each had their specialty. Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Blaise for throats, Saint Christopher for safe travel. Pilgrimages, two holy shrines, became huge events, part spiritual journey, part medieval tourism. If you could touch a saint's relic, a bone, a scrap of clothing, or even a vial of dust, it was believed to carry divine power. Superstition was layered on top of all this. Charms, talismans, and amulets were worn for protection. People believed in witches, demons, and the evil eye. If your crops failed, it wasn't bad weather. It was probably a curse. To fight back, holy water, blessed candles, and protective prayers were common. But the church's grip wasn't all doom and gloom. Monasteries preserved knowledge, copying ancient texts. Cathedrals rose like stone mountains, filled with stained glass that turned sunlight into glowing scripture. Festivals mixed faith with fun. Parades, plays, feasts, and music that turned holy days into community celebrations. Still, there was no escaping the fact that religion dictated every layer of life. Your sins, your salvation, your meals, your marriage, all fell under the church's eyes. And if you strayed too far, well, there were always inquisitors ready to remind you of your place. From here, let us wander from the sacred to the more playful, because not everything in medieval life was fear and fasting. People still laughed, played games, and tried to carve out a little joy. For all the hardship, medieval people weren't just toiling and praying all day. They carved out time for fun. Though, as you might expect, the games of the rich and poor looked a little different. For peasants, leisure often meant simple games played outdoors. Think of ball games that were chaotic ancestors of modern soccer. No rules, no referees, just a lot of shouting, running, and the occasional broken bone. Children carved toys out of wood, rolled hoops, or played with knuckle bones, which were basically the medieval version of dice. Music was always close by too, a fiddle, a pipe, or just clapping hands around a fire. Festivals were the highlight of the year. May Day, harvest celebrations, and Christmas brought dancing, feasting, and a chance to shake off the grind of work. There were plays performed in village squares, with costumes made from whatever was lying around. And don't forget the ever-popular drinking contests, because ale and wine flowed freely whenever there was something worth celebrating. For the nobility, entertainment was grander. Hunting was the ultimate pastime, a mix of sport, training, and showing off. A nobleman might ride out with his hawks for falconry, or join a massive boar hunt with hounds. Jousting tournaments were another favorite, part sport, part theater. Knights in shining armor clashed for glory. While crowds cheered, nobles placed bets, and ladies pretended not to be too impressed. Board games like chess and backgammon made their way into noble halls, carried from the East during the Crusades. Chess, in particular, became a way to show off strategy and wit, though it also doubled as a chance to gossip across the board. Storytelling filled in the quiet evenings. Minstrels sang ballads, troubadours composed love songs, and wandering performers told tales of King Arthur or Charlemagne. These stories weren't just entertainment, they reinforced ideas of chivalry, romance, and what it meant to be noble. Even monasteries had their version of fun. Monks played board games, brewed ale, and on rare occasions, celebrated with festivals of their own, though usually with a stricter sense of fun than what went on outside their cloisters. And let's not forget the medieval love of animals in sport. Sometimes cruel, sometimes festive. Bear baiting, cockfighting, and dogfights were sadly common. By today's standards, brutal. But to them, it was excitement in a world that didn't have Netflix. So yes, life was hard, but laughter and games were still part of the rhythm. People needed joy just as much as bread, and they found it wherever they could. In fields, in halls, or under the flicker of torchlight. And now, let's step away from games and feasts, and drift into something a little less cheerful, but very defining of the medieval world. Crime, punishment, and the old Sargrim justice system. Justice, in the Middle Ages, wasn't exactly what you'd call fair. It was often brutal, sometimes theatrical, and almost always designed to make an example out of someone. The idea wasn't so much about rehabilitation as it was about scaring everyone else into obedience. Let's start with trials. Evidence and witnesses were nice when available, but many cases relied on what was called trial by ordeal. This was a divine test, where God was expected to reveal the truth. You might be forced to hold a red-hot iron, or plunge your hand into boiling water. If the wound healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it festered, well, tough luck. Another method was trial by water. You'd be thrown into a pond or river. If you floated, you were guilty, because the water rejected you. If you sank, you were innocent, though you might also be drowned, which was less convenient. Nobles had their own option. Trial by combat. Accused of a crime, challenge your accuser to a duel. God would supposedly grant victory to the righteous. Of course, having good armor and years of training probably helped more than divine justice. But details. When it came to punishments, they ranged from mildly humiliating to grotesquely cruel. For smaller crimes, gossiping, cheating at the market, public drunkenness, you might end up in the stocks, locked in a wooden frame in the town square, while everyone pelted you with rotten vegetables. A scolding tongue, literally a metal device that clamped your mouth shut, was reserved for women who talked too much. For bigger crimes like theft or rebellion, punishments escalated. Hanging was the standard go-to. Sometimes, though, things got more creative. Branding, mutilation, or exile were used to mark criminals for life. And for treason, the ultimate crime, the punishment was often public, drawn out, and theatrical, involving dismemberment or worse. Medieval justice loved an audience. Then there's torture, which became especially notorious during the later medieval period. Devices like the rack, which stretched your body until joints dislocated, or the thumbscrews, which did exactly what they sound like, were used to extract confessions. The Iron Maiden, that spiked coffin of horror, is actually more of a Renaissance myth than a medieval reality. But there were plenty of genuine nasties without it. And, of course, the witch trials that crept in toward the later Middle Ages. Women, and some men, accused of sorcery, could be subjected to water ordeals, torture, and eventual execution. The paranoia around magic and heresy meant justice was often little more than a theater of fear. It's grim, yes, but it also tells us something important. Law wasn't just about keeping order. It was about reinforcing power, of lords over peasants, of the church over heretics, of kings over rivals. Punishment was a performance, a reminder of who controlled life and death. And from these dark gallows and echoing dungeons, maybe it's time to drift into something equally defining of medieval life, but on a grander stage. Warfare and the endless cycle of battles that shaped kingdoms. Warfare in the Middle Ages was both constant and strangely ritualized. It wasn't quite the non-stop chaos we imagine, but when battles came, they were brutal, noisy, and exhausting. The knight was the poster child of this era. Picture the shining armor, the horse draped in a colorful caparison, the family crest fluttering on the shield. It's a glamorous image, but the reality was sweaty, expensive, and uncomfortable. Armor was heavy. Chainmail alone could weigh 50 pounds, and full plate, which developed later, was like walking around in a steel oven. Training started young, with boys serving as pages, then squires, before finally being dubbed knights in elaborate ceremonies. Knights were bound by the code of chivalry, which in theory emphasized honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak. In practice, it often translated to protecting their own interests and occasionally raiding the weak. Still, the ideal of the gallant knight persisted, helped along by troubadours and romantic tales of Arthur and Lancelot. When it came to actual fighting, battles weren't always giant set-piece clashes. Skirmishes, sieges, and raids were far more common. Castles played a huge role here. A well-built castle was like a stone fist planted in the landscape. High walls, towers, moats, and drawbridges made them nearly impossible to storm directly. So, armies settled into long, grinding sieges, trying to starve defenders out. Siege warfare had its own terrifying toolkit. Catapults hurled stones, firepots, or even diseased carcasses over the walls. Battering rams slammed into gates. Siege towers, those massive rolling wooden contraptions, allowed attackers to climb up and over. Defenders countered with boiling oil, arrows, and sometimes just heavy rocks dropped from above. It was a waiting game. Patience, supplies, and morale usually decided who won. For ordinary soldiers, the infantry, life was rough. Armed with spears, axes, or whatever they could afford, they bore the brunt of battle while nobles got the glory. Archers, especially longbowmen in England, became decisive in some famous battles. The longbow's range and power made it a medieval game-changer, capable of punching through armor at impressive distances. And then there were the wars that stretched across generations, like the 100 Years' War between England and France. Not one war, but a long tangle of battles, truces, and resumptions that shaped both kingdoms. Soldiers marched back and forth, villages burned, and peasants bore the brunt of the destruction. Of course, the church got involved too, through the Crusades. These were framed as holy wars to reclaim Jerusalem, but they were also about power, land, and prestige. Crusaders trudged thousands of miles, enduring hunger, disease, and endless skirmishes. Some went for piety, others for plunder. The result was a complicated, bloody mix of faith and politics that left scars for centuries. So, medieval war wasn't just knights charging on horseback. Though that did happen. It was long campaigns, grinding sieges, and endless costs in lives and coin. Glory was rare. Mud, hunger, and exhaustion were more common. And after so much blood and iron, maybe it's time to slide into something a little quieter. How people actually lived inside those castles and manors when they weren't tea-fighting. From the outside, castles looked like symbols of power and romance. Towers piercing the sky, walls that seem unshakable. But on the inside, daily life was a mix of grandeur and inconvenience. The Great Hall was the beating heart of the castle. Picture a cavernous space with high beams, a roaring hearth, and long wooden tables. Here, meals were served, justice was dispensed, and entertainment unfolded. The lord sat at the high table, of course, while everyone else sorted themselves down the line according to rank. Servants bustled about, dogs lurked underfoot, hoping for scraps, and the smoke from the fire drifted upward. Though, without chimneys early on, much of it just lingered in the air. Cozy, if you didn't mind coughing through dinner. Sleeping arrangements were equally practical. The lord and lady might have their own chambers, but many people simply rolled out pallets in the hall. Privacy was rare. Curtains or wooden screens helped, but walls were thin, and so were the secrets. Castles were also bustling workplaces. Cooks in smoky kitchens roasted meats and stirred potages. Blacksmiths hammered in forges. Seamstresses mended clothing, while grooms cared for the lord's prized horses. At any given time, dozens, even hundreds, of people lived and worked within the walls. Hygiene was not exactly modern. Bathing happened, but not daily, and hot baths were a treat. Some castles had rudimentary latrines, known as garobis, which were basically stone seats over a chute leading down the wall. The smell, exactly what you're imagining. For noble women, life was a mix of management and display. A lady of the castle often oversaw the household, directed servants, and managed supplies when her husband was away at war. She also did the social work, entertaining guests, arranging marriages, and sometimes even handling local disputes. Children, meanwhile, were raised in a very different environment from today. Noble sons might be sent off as pages in another lord's household by age 7, beginning their training for knighthood. Daughters were often taught the arts of running an estate, learning embroidery, music, and, of course, how to secure advantageous marriages. Childhood was short, and responsibility came early. Despite the cold and drafty walls, castles weren't all gloom. Feasts brought music, dancing, and storytelling. Troubadours sang songs of courtly love. Jesters cracked jokes, some funnier than others, and elaborate entertainments, like mummers' plays, filled the evenings. Life inside a castle was part survival, part spectacle, half gritty reality, half stage show of wealth and power. And yet, for all their grandeur, castles were vulnerable. Sieges tested their strength, and fire or famine could make even the strongest walls feel fragile. They weren't just homes, but statements. I'm here, I'm powerful, and don't even think about challenging me. From the stone halls of lords, let us wander down to something far less glamorous, but just as essential. The daily grind of peasants in their villages. If castles were the symbols of power, villages were the engine that kept everything running. Around 90% of medieval people were peasants, bound to the land, and their world looked very different from the lords they served. Picture a small cluster of wattle, landau cottages, thatched roofs patched with straw, smoke curling out of little holes since chimneys were a luxury. Floors were often just hard-packed earth, strewn with rushes or hay that soaked up. Well, everything. A pig might wander in and out of the doorway. Chickens, too. Privacy wasn't a big thing. Families, animals, and sometimes even neighbors all lived close together. The rhythm of peasant life was ruled by the seasons. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer was long days in the fields. Autumn brought harvest, where every able hand, children included, worked to bring in grain. Winter was quieter, but also harsher, with little to eat beyond salted meat, hard bread, and whatever had been stored away. Work was constant. Men plowed with oxen, mended tools, or worked under the Lord's orders. Women tended gardens, spun wool, baked bread, and raised children while also helping in the fields. Children grew up fast, herding geese, fetching water, and learning the grind of survival from an early age. Taxes were heavy, and they weren't just in money. A peasant owed labor to the Lord, working his fields a certain number of days each year, or repairing his roads and fences. The church also took its share in the form of the tithe, a tenth of everything, even if that meant your family went hungry. Meals were simple but filling when times were good. Pottage, bread, ale, and maybe some cheese. Meat was rare, often reserved for festivals. Most peasants lived closer to a vegetarian diet, though not by choice. Hunger was a familiar companion, and a bad harvest could push whole villages to the brink of famine. But life wasn't all toil. Festivals, holy days, and village fairs broke the monotony. There was music, dancing, and drinking. Moments when the community came alive. Storytelling by the hearth, riddles, and songs filled long winter nights. Even in hard times, people found ways to laugh, celebrate, and carry on. For all the poverty and hardship, villages were tight-knit. Neighbors depended on each other, sharing tools, lending a hand at harvest, standing together in disputes. Your world was small, but it was your world, bounded by fields, forests, and the ringing of the church bell. And while peasants rarely made it into the chronicles of history, their labor was the foundation that allowed kings, knights, and nobles to wage wars, build castles, and host feasts. From these muddy lanes and smoky cottages, let us wander back up the social ladder to see how royal courts and their endless politics set the tone for so much of medieval life. If the village was about survival, the court was about spectacle. A royal court wasn't just where the king or queen lived. It was a stage, a political arena, and sometimes a very fancy cage. Life at court revolved around the monarch. Every gesture, every word, every smile from the ruler carried weight. To be close to the king or queen meant influence, and influence meant power. Courtiers, nobles, advisors, ladies-in-waiting, and ambitious hangers-on clustered like moths around the royal flame, desperate for attention. The daily routine could look dazzling. Banquets with endless courses, music played by minstrels, tournaments held for amusement, and dances that carried on late into the night. People wore their wealth quite literally. Silks, velvets, and jewels that screamed status. The richer and more impractical your clothing, the more it said about your place in the world. But beneath the glitter was constant scheming. Alliances were made and broken with a whispered word. A misplaced joke, a poorly timed refusal, or the wrong expression at dinner could ruin a career. Many courtiers spent more time maneuvering for favor than doing anything practical. Marriage was the ultimate tool of politics. Royal weddings weren't about romance. They were about strategy. A princess might be sent across Europe to cement an alliance. Sometimes at the age of 12 or 13, kings weighed potential spouses like bargaining chips. Does she bring land, soldiers, a claim to a throne? The personal happiness of the bride and groom was, let's say, optional. And then there was the gossip. Courts thrived on it. Who was sleeping with whom? Who had fallen out of favor? Who was suddenly rich or mysteriously ill? Rumors could be deadly. A whisper of treason, sorcery, or even just bad manners could see you exiled, imprisoned, or worse. Foreign ambassadors added another layer of drama. They were guests, spies, and negotiators all at once, observing every move and reporting back to their own monarchs. The court wasn't just about domestic politics. It was an international showcase. For royals themselves, the court was both a throne and a trap. Kings and queens lived in luxury, but they were never alone, never unwatched, never free from expectation. Every meal, every prayer, even every trip to bed was surrounded by ceremony. Power came with constant pressure, and a single mistake could topple dynasties. So, royal courts were theaters, dazzling, dangerous, and endlessly entertaining for those inside. But for the rest of the realm, they often seemed like distant worlds where silk-draped people played games, while ordinary folk slogged through mud. From here, let's drift into a part of medieval life that touched everyone. From kings to peasants, the Black Death, the plague that reshaped Europe forever. In the mid-14th century, Europe met a nightmare. It came creeping in from the east, carried by ships, hidden in the fur of rats and the bite of fleas. At first, it was whispers, strange deaths in distant ports, but soon, it was everywhere. The Black Death, the disease tore through Europe like wildfire. Entire villages vanished within weeks. City streets filled with carts piled high with corpses, while priests rang bells and muttered last rites until their voices gave out. The symptoms were horrifying. Swellings called buboes, blackened skin, fevers that burned, and a death that often came within days. People panicked, of course. Some fled, abandoning families. Others turned to prayer, convinced it was divine punishment. Flagellants, men who whipped themselves in public, wandered from town to town, hoping their suffering might appease God's wrath. Suspicion and fear boiled over, and tragically, minorities like Jewish communities were scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells. Thousands were slaughtered in waves of violence born from terror. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that between a third and half of Europe's population was wiped out between 1347 and 1351. Entire generations were gone in a handful of years. Imagine losing every other person you know. Neighbors, friends, even whole families. All erased in the span of a season. But as devastating as it was, the plague didn't just destroy, it transformed. With so many people gone, labor suddenly became valuable. Peasants could demand better wages or simply walk away from oppressive landlords. Feudal structures cracked under the strain. Cities reorganized, economies shifted, and the seeds of change, even the Renaissance itself, were sown in that soil of loss. The church, once the unshakable authority, took a blow too. So many priests had died, so many prayers had gone unanswered, that faith was shaken. People began questioning old structures of power and belief. Out of death came doubt, and out of doubt came new ways of thinking. And yet, life went on. Survivors rebuilt, children were born, and slowly, Europe emerged, scarred but changed. The Black Death was both an ending and a beginning, a shadow that haunted the Middle Ages, and a force that propelled the world toward something new. If you found yourself sick in the Middle Ages, well, good luck. Doctors existed, yes, but what they believed about the body and disease was more medieval philosophy than modern biology. At the heart of it all was the theory of the four humors. You had blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile sloshing around inside you, at least according to medical wisdom of the time. If you were healthy, those humors were balanced. If you were sick, well, clearly one of them was out of whack. The solution: adjust the humors. How bloodletting was the classic choice. A physician might open a vein or apply leeches to draw out excess blood. Fever. Obviously too much hot, wet humor in you. Melancholy. That would be the black bile acting up, and vomiting was practically considered a cure-all. The body's way of resetting itself. Herbal remedies were also common, though most were based on superstition rather than science. Garlic for protection, sage for wisdom, rosemary for memory. Some herbs had genuine healing properties, but dosage, preparation, and understanding were hit or miss. Astrology played a huge role. The doctors timed treatments according to the alignment of the stars and planets. A surgeon might refuse to operate if Mars was in the wrong place in the sky. Medical charts showing the zodiac man mapped body parts to astrological signs, guiding everything from diets to surgeries. For the average villager, though, medicine wasn't doctors with long robes and fancy books. It was the local wise woman, midwife, or herbalist. They knew which plants eased a cough, which poultices soothed a wound, and which charms might scare away spirits. Sometimes, their remedies worked better than what university-trained doctors prescribed. And, of course, prayer was everywhere. Illness was often seen as punishment from God. So repentance, pilgrimages, and relics of saints were used as cures. You might drink water that had washed a saint's bones, or press a holy metal to your sores. Miraculous healings were hoped for, even if they didn't come. It all sounds strange to us now, but in a world without microscopes, without vaccines, without antibiotics, these beliefs gave people comfort. They provided a sense of control in the face of sickness. Even if the cure was little more than faith, herbs, and a sharp blade for bleeding. For medieval women, pregnancy and childbirth were a constant balancing act between hope and peril. Hospitals, as we know them, didn't exist, and most births took place at home. surrounded by family, neighbors, and the local midwife. Midwives were the true experts of their day. They oversaw labor, guided delivery, and dispensed herbal remedies to ease pain or speed contractions. Some were skilled, others relied on tradition, charm, and a little guesswork. Medical books existed, but they were written for learned men, not the women actually delivering babies. Childbirth was risky. Maternal mortality rates were high, and many women died in labor from infections, hemorrhage, or complications modern medicine can usually prevent. Newborns were fragile too, with high infant mortality. A surviving child was considered a blessing and often a miracle, given the odds stacked against them. Religious faith infused the process. Prayers to saints, charms, and holy water were common. Women might wear amulets to protect against evil spirits or recite specific prayers to ensure a safe birth. These rituals weren't just superstition. They provided comfort and structure in moments of extreme vulnerability. Nutrition played a subtle but important role. Pregnant women were advised to eat hearty meals and sometimes specific herbs thought to promote an easier delivery. But famine, poverty, or hard labor often made nutrition inadequate, which compounded risks. Interestingly, childbirth could also be a social event. Neighbors might gather to offer support, sing, or chant protective songs. It was communal in a way we rarely see today. Birth wasn't just a private affair. It was part of village life. Despite all these dangers, women were resilient. They endured repeated pregnancies, rough labors, and still managed households, fields, and communities. The risks were high, the knowledge limited, but life pressed on. And somehow, the cycle of birth and death continued, generation after generation. From the intensity of birth, let's gently shift to something a little less intimate but equally revealing. Medieval childhood and the lives of noble children. Being a child in the Middle Ages was a lot different than today. For most, it meant work from sunrise to sunset. But for noble children, life was more complicated. A mix of privilege, training, and relentless preparation for the responsibilities awaiting them. Boys destined to be knights had their lives planned almost from birth. At around 7 years old, they were sent to other noble households as pages, learning manners, basic reading, and the art of horsemanship. Pages polished armor, served meals, and observed the adults around them, absorbing lessons in etiquette, loyalty, and court politics. By their teens, they became squires, assisting knights directly, carrying shields, caring for horses, and practicing with swords. Survival wasn't guaranteed. Accidents were common, and a fall from a horse or a wayward lance could end a young life before the knighting ceremony ever arrived. Girls, meanwhile, had a very different education. Noble daughters were trained to run a household, manage estates, and entertain guests. They learned music, embroidery, and languages, but also the subtler arts of diplomacy and marriage negotiation. Marriage for political gain often arrived early, sometimes in their early teens. Love, personal preference, and comfort were rarely considered. Childhood wasn't all training and lessons though. Noble children played. They had dolls, miniature weapons, and board games. Hunting or falconry could be part of play for boys, and girls might practice needlework with a competitive streak. Pets were common, and some children even had small private chapels or gardens within castle walls. Yet danger lurked even in play. Castles were drafty, cold, and filled with stone steps, open hearths, and heavy doors. Sickness spread quickly in close quarters. And death, unfortunately, was never far away. Many children didn't survive to adulthood, even among the privileged. Still, noble children were raised to expect responsibility early. Every game, every lesson, every social interaction prepared them for a life of influence, power, and sometimes cruelty. Childhood was fleeting, a delicate bridge between the cradle and the throne. From these sheltered halls, let's float into something even more human. The weird, darkly humorous, and sometimes tragic personal quirks of medieval monarchs. Medieval kings and queens weren't just rulers. They were humans, which means they had strange habits, odd obsessions, and moments that now make us raise an eyebrow. Take Charles VI of France, for instance, known as Charles the Mad. Periodically, he would lose touch with reality completely. He sometimes forgot he had a wife and children, refused to recognize friends, or believed he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. Courtiers tiptoed around him, which must have been exhausting, and France lurched through political chaos under his intermittent madness. Then there's King Henry VIII, famous for a few things: breaking from the church, 6 marriages, and a notable obsession with hunting. He also reportedly had a taste for extravagance bordering on the absurd. Banquets with dozens of dishes, clothing heavy with jewels, and entertainments that could last for days. Henry likes to show power, wealth, and physical presence all at once, sometimes to the point of self-indulgence. Isabella of France, meanwhile, had a flair for drama. Married to Edward II of England, she effectively staged a coup with her lover, Roger Mortimer, overthrowing her husband. She was politically shrewd, but stories of her iron will and exacting vengeance have become legendary. She might have been the medieval queen everyone feared to cross. Oddities weren't limited to politics. Charles II of Navarre, known as Charles the Bad, reportedly had a penchant for poison and intrigue so extreme that his contemporaries whispered constantly about what he might do next. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, had a fascination with falconry and natural science. He dissected animals and wrote treatises on everything from birds to human anatomy. Sometimes he was so absorbed in study that governance took a back seat. Even mundane habits could become legendary. Some monarchs bathed obsessively, others avoided baths entirely. Some slept during the day and ruled at night. Some insisted on eating alone, or only with specific silverware, or while listening to a certain musician. Small obsessions, of course, could carry huge consequences. A neglected army, a forgotten alliance, or a scandalous rumor that rippled through the court. These quirks make monarchs human, flawed, eccentric, and occasionally terrifying. Behind the crowns and robes were people with fears, obsessions, and habits that shaped history just as much as battles or decrees did. From royal oddities, let us drift into the strange and sometimes dangerous world of medieval entertainment. From jousts to feasts, and all the odd customs in between. Medieval entertainment was a curious mix of danger, skill, and sometimes sheer absurdity. It reflected social hierarchy, religious influence, and the ever-present need for distraction in a tough world. For the nobility, tournaments were the ultimate spectacle. Knights donned armor, mounted on horses, and clashed with lances and jousts. It was dangerous, theatrical, and expensive. The perfect way to show off wealth and skill. Spectators cheered, nobles wagered fortunes, and sometimes injuries were part of the drama. These events weren't just sport. They were a way to display power, secure alliances, and occasionally settle grudges. Feasts were another form of entertainment. A medieval banquet could last hours, even days, with endless courses of meat, bread, and wine. Music floated through the halls. Minstrels with lutes, fiddles, and drums, performing ballads of love, heroism, or scandal. Court jesters added levity, making jokes, performing acrobatics, or delivering subtle commentary on court life. A good jester could speak truth to a monarch, cloaked in humor, without losing their head. Though the line was thin, games and pastimes were also popular. Chess and backgammon challenged minds, hunting tested skill and patience, and falconry displayed both mastery and prestige. Even dice games and simple gambling offered moments of thrill. For children of nobles, miniature versions of these activities were common. Little swords, tiny animals, or mock tournaments in castle courtyards. Odd customs often accompanied entertainment. Some festivals involved masked dances or elaborate costumes, while others had food fights, mock battles, or pageantry that could feel like a theatrical circus. Public executions, while grim, were considered a form of communal spectacle and social instruction. Markets also doubled as entertainment, with performers, storytellers, and musicians drawing crowds. Peasants found amusement in simpler ways: singing, dancing, storytelling, and seasonal games kept communities connected. Celebrations tied to religious festivals or harvests were highlights of the year, a brief respite from toil. Even with hardships, people sought joy wherever possible. Entertainment in the Middle Ages wasn't just frivolous. It reinforced social order, demonstrated wealth, and offered psychological escape. Whether a knight jousting, a jester performing, or villagers dancing around a maypole, life demanded both work and occasional wonder. From entertainment, let's gently drift into the art, architecture, and the everyday beauty of the Middle Ages. Because not everything was grim, dangerous, or exhausting. When most people think of the Middle Ages, grim battles and blackened streets might come to mind. But the era also produced breathtaking art and architecture, a testament to human creativity amid struggle. Castles and cathedrals were the crown jewels of medieval construction. Cathedrals soared like stone mountains, with arches stretching toward heaven. Flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, and intricate stained glass weren't just decorative. They were engineering marvels. Sunlight streaming through colored glass turned interiors into glowing, celestial spaces. Every pane told a story. Saints, biblical scenes, and moral lessons, accessible even to those who couldn't read. Inside castles, walls were adorned with tapestries. These weren't just decoration. They insulated cold stone rooms and told tales of battles, hunts, and legends. Nobles invested in intricate embroidery and carved furniture, creating interiors that reflected both status and taste. Everyday objects were often works of art. Metalwork, pottery, and jewelry blended function with beauty. Illuminated manuscripts were another marvel. Monks and scribes spent countless hours crafting texts with delicate calligraphy, gold leaf, and miniature illustrations. These books preserved knowledge, stories, and religious teachings, often with incredible artistry that could make even the simplest prayer book mesmerizing. Art wasn't just for the elite. Even peasants expressed creativity through carvings, painted signs, and ritual objects. Festivals featured colorful banners and masks. Folk songs, storytelling, and communal dances brought aesthetic pleasure into the rhythms of everyday life. Gardens and nature were carefully shaped, too. Monastery gardens grew herbs for medicine, vegetables for sustenance, and flowers for beauty. Nobles maintained ornamental gardens, labyrinths, and hunting grounds, blending utility with elegance. Even small villages valued color and decoration. Flowers, painted doors, and festive attire brightened otherwise harsh. Despite harsh living conditions, medieval people sought beauty in stone, fabric, light, and life itself. It reminds us that creativity, wonder, and a desire to inspire weren't luxuries. They were a fundamental part of being human. Even in the toughest times, medieval people lived in a world full of unseen forces. Ghosts, spirits, curses, and divine signs weren't just stories. They were explanations for illness, bad luck, or misfortune. And honestly, when life was short, dangerous, and unpredictable, who could blame them for looking for answers beyond what they could see? Witches and sorcery were everywhere in the imagination. People believed that curses could ruin crops, cause sickness, or even kill. Amulets, charms, and prayers were commonly used to ward off evil. Some symbols were worn around the neck, some etched on doors, and others simply whispered as incantations. Even everyday actions, knocking on wood, avoiding certain animals, or tossing salt over a shoulder, were embedded in a culture deeply attuned to luck and misfortune. The church had a big influence on beliefs. Saints' relics were considered powerful. Touching a piece of bone, a piece of cloth, or a shard of a holy object could heal illness or protect from evil. Pilgrimages to holy sites were popular, sometimes as penance, sometimes in hope of miracles. And confession, indulgences, and prayers were intertwined with the sense that human action could sway divine favor. Animals carried symbolic weight. Black cats, owls, and other creatures were seen as omens. Certain birds foretold death or fortune. People interpreted natural events, eclipses, comets, storms, as messages from God, signs of coming, doom, or change. Even everyday coincidences could be woven into these mystical narratives. Superstitions extended to medicine, marriage, and agriculture. A sick person might be treated with charms and herbs. A bride might wear specific colors for luck, and farmers performed rituals to ensure harvests. Life was unpredictable, so rituals and beliefs offered a sense of control, even if the outcomes were arbitrary. And let us not forget the festivals and holidays steeped in superstition, masks to ward off evil, dancing around fires, and strange costumes that blended pagan traditions with Christian observance. Life and belief were inseparable. The mystical was everywhere. For medieval people, faith was woven into almost everything. From sunrise prayers to evening blessings, the church dictated not only belief but behavior, holidays, and the rhythm of work. Life without religion would have been unthinkable. It was the lens through which people understood the world. Churches and cathedrals dominated villages and towns, not just physically, but socially. Bells marked the hours, called the faithful to prayer, and announced births, marriages, and deaths. Festivals of saints, holy days, and Easter or Christmas punctuated the calendar, providing both spiritual significance and rare breaks from labor. Daily life was infused with rituals. Farmers blessed their fields before planting. Families prayed for health and protection, and individuals confessed sins to secure divine favor. Pilgrimages offered spiritual merit, sometimes in exchange for indulgences, or simply as penance. Even the smallest actions, lighting a candle, sprinkling holy water, or making the sign of the cross, were acts of devotion. Religion also shaped morality and justice. Sin wasn't just a personal matter, it affected communities. Theft, dishonesty, or even gossip could be condemned morally and sometimes punished legally. Monks and nuns played crucial roles, preserving knowledge, educating children, and providing care for the sick. Saints' stories were repeated endlessly, reinforcing ideals of piety, virtue, and obedience. Yet, faith coexisted with superstition. Miracles, visions, omens, and relics mingled with prayers and sermons. People genuinely believed the spiritual and the mystical influenced daily life. The boundary between religion and magic, between the sacred and the superstitious, was often blurry, and that blur shaped the rhythms, hopes, and fears of medieval existence. Even for kings and queens, religion dictated protocol. Coronations, marriages, and laws all required ecclesiastical sanction. Monarchs claimed divine right, while the church wielded moral authority that could challenge or support rulers. Faith was power, political, social, and personal. Life in the Middle Ages, then, was framed by faith, superstition, and ritual. Every task, from plowing a field to crowning a king, carried spiritual significance. And in a world filled with uncertainty, disease, famine, war, religion offered both structure and solace. Food in the Middle Ages was as much about survival as it was about pleasure. What you ate depended heavily on your social class, your region, and the seasons. Spoiled food, famine, and disease made eating a daily negotiation with fortune. For peasants, meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, often coarse, dark, and heavy, was the mainstay, accompanied by pottage, a thick stew made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish. Meat was rare for peasants, usually reserved for special occasions. Ale, weak but filling, was a daily drink, safer than water, which could be contaminated. Herbs and whatever vegetables they could grow added some flavor, but most meals were functional rather than delicious. Nobles, however, had a very different experience. Banquets were displays of wealth and power. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, pies, sauces, and exotic spices imported from across Europe and the East. Dishes might include peacock or swan, presented whole, sometimes even redressed with their feathers for dramatic effect. Sugar was rare and prized. Honey was more common as a sweetener. Spices were more than flavorings. They were status symbols. Black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron indicated wealth and sophistication. The richer the household, the more exotic and expensive the spices. Presentation was key. Cooks used elaborate carving, sauces, in colors to impress guests. Meals were also social rituals. Banquets included seating hierarchies, etiquette rules, and entertainment like music or juggling. Even in smaller households, meals were occasions to enforce social order, with peasants eating communally and following strict patterns. Food safety was a gamble. Meat could spoil quickly, bread could be infested, and poorly stored grains could cause illness. Yet, despite the risks, people adapted preservation methods. Salting, smoking, pickling, and fermenting were common. Drink wasn't limited to ale. Wine was popular among the nobility, often watered down for daily use. Mead and cider were also common, depending on the region. Water, while available, was often avoided due to contamination. So medieval cuisine was a mix of survival, status, and spectacle. It reflected geography, class, and culture, offering insight into both daily life and the grand theatricality of noble life. Clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about warmth or modesty. It was a statement of status, identity, and sometimes even political allegiance. Fabrics, colors, and cuts signaled your place in the social hierarchy, and breaking dress codes could be scandalous or even illegal. For peasants, practicality ruled. Wool, linen, and simple leather made up most garments. Tunics, simple dresses, cloaks, and sturdy boots protected against the cold and rain. Bright colors were rare. Dyes were expensive. Clothing was patched and handed down whenever possible, because a single set might last years, sometimes decades. Nobles, on the other hand, were a walking display of wealth. Silk, velvet, and brocade were common among the upper classes. Furs lined cloaks for warmth and status. Colors were vibrant and sometimes highly regulated. Laws called sumptuary laws dictated which fabrics and hues different classes could wear. Only the richest could flaunt certain shades of purple, blue, or red, because these colors symbolized power and prestige. Accessories added another layer. Belts, hats, gloves, and jewelry were both decorative and functional. A noblewoman's headdress could stretch to elaborate heights, sometimes supported by wireframes. Men wore doublets, hose, and pointed shoes, some so long they were more fashionable than practical. Buttons, embroidery, and fur trimming signaled wealth, while a cleverly placed brooch or ring could mark allegiance or status. Children's clothing mirrored adult fashion, though in simpler forms. Boys training as pages wore tunics and leggings. Girls wore miniature gowns. Clothing also taught etiquette, the way a garment hung, the care taken in wearing it, and the accessories chosen reflected upbringing and training. Fashion could also be political. Wearing a rival's colors or styles could be interpreted as support or rebellion. Tastes shifted with trends, influenced by courtly life, foreign trade, and even warfare. The arrival of new fabrics, dyes, and techniques from abroad sparked trends that nobles rushed to adopt. And beneath the grandeur, clothing was practical too, layered for warmth, designed for movement, and sometimes tailored to conceal weapons. Every piece carried meaning, from status to identity to intention.